So for the next installment of Richard Iron's acclaimed In Conversation series, we're joined from London by CNN Chief International Correspondent Clarissa Ward. Over her 15-year career with Fox, CBS, ABC, and now CNN, Clarissa has won an amazing array of awards, including 5 Emmys and 2 Peabodys, and she's just published a book, On All Fronts, The Education of a Journalist. It's a great read, it's readily available, and I commend it to you. Leading the conversation is Richard Iron. Richard served for 37 years in the British Army, and including in many of the hotspots where Clarissa subsequently reported from. He was a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford in their Changing Character of War program, and not least, he's the new president of AAA Victoria. So I would just now ask them to start the videos and we will start the show.
I'm not able to start my video, sorry. It's saying
Okay.
the host has to do it, forgive me.
Sorry.
There we go.
Okay, very good. Sorry for that minor glitch with Zoom. We're getting it. Anyway, thank you both very much. Good morning to you, Clarissa. Welcome both. And Richard, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Clarissa Ward in London. Now, you're one of the most accomplished and experienced international journalists of your generation. So it's a delight for me to be able to talk to you. And you're currently in one of journalism's most prestigious posts. But it wasn't always like that, was it? I gather before 9/11, you haven't even thought about becoming a journalist. So what happened? How did you become a war correspondent?
Well, thank you. And it's great to be here with you so early in the morning here in London. So I always loved traveling. I always loved telling stories as a child, but it was only in my senior year at university. I was studying comparative literature at Yale. I actually thought I wanted to be an actress. And 1 week into my senior year, 9/11 happened. And I think like many Americans, my world was kind of turned upside down. I became completely consumed with this idea of how had this happened? Why did people hate America so much? What did we not understand about the rest of the world and the way the rest of the world saw us? And how could we have missed so many cues and clues? And so I decided then and there that I wanted to be a journalist. And I knew fundamentally that I wanted to go to the tip of the spear. I didn't really know what that meant yet. I just understood that I wanted to be out in sort of the far-flung corners of the earth, telling the stories of people there, and also hopefully in the process bringing something of America's stories to the rest of the world as well, essentially acting as a communicator between different cultures.
Well, we'll come back to the tip of the spear quite because you spent a lot of time. And the tip of the spear, as I've learned, can be a pretty uncomfortable place. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a run around the world. And I'm going to ask you a series of questions about different places that you serve. And we're going to start with the Middle East. And we'll also end with the Middle East later. But you spent a lot of time in the Middle East, including Israel and Palestine. Now, when I first worked in the Gulf in the 1980s, the Israel-Palestine issue was the one issue that every Arab wanted to talk to me about. It's one issue that united every Arab, pro-Palestine, anti-Israel. But today, the big issue, the thing that everybody wants to talk about, of course, is the Sunni-Shia divide. Conflict between Iran and Saudi, the civil war within Islam. And of course, a number of Arab states have now established relations with Israel. So the question is, do you think it's all over for the Palestinians? Has the Sunni-Shia divide essentially kicked them off the front page to the extent that international pressure for an equitable solution is off the table forever?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's an excellent question. And I would have to say it doesn't look good for the Palestinians right now, because for many years, those of us who cover these areas closely have understood that it was largely lip service coming from many of these Arab states, and that they were in fact interested in having relationships with Israel, that they were already having those relations behind closed doors because of mutual areas of interest, economic cooperation, software that allows you to essentially spy on your own citizens, but primarily, as you said, because of Iran. Because many decades ago, everyone was united, or certainly all the Sunni Muslim Arab states were united around the idea that Israel was the great enemy. And fast forward to present day, and frankly, the last 10 years, Iran has taken that seat. Iran has taken that place. And that means, you know, under the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Israel has become kind of a crucial behind the scenes ally to some of the Gulf states. Now we see that openly carried out for the world to see with the normalization of relations between Israel and Bahrain, Israel and the UAE. And the big question is, will Saudi Arabia come next? If Saudi Arabia does decide to normalize relations with Israel, and some had speculated that this could be the October surprise in the US election, because it of course would be a big boon for President Trump. I'm not sure that's going to happen, because it would be a monumental step. I think that the Saudi Arabia establishment, the Crown Prince, would be risking some kind of an insurrection in their own country, because what's important to distinguish when we talk about Arab states no longer care about the Palestinians, or Arab states welcome the normalization of relations with Israel, there is a really big chasm between Arab states and the Arab street. And that's important for people to remember. What Arab leaders say does not necessarily reflect the will of the populace. I do think that, broadly speaking, on the Arab street, when you travel, you will see a lot of sympathy for Palestine. You will find a lot of people very uncomfortable with the normalization of relations with Israel in some countries in the Gulf. But because of the nature of the way the most of the Arab states are ruled, people are careful about expressing it publicly, and they're not going to rock the boat, so to speak. But for the moment, yes, I think the Palestinians are in real trouble, because the fact that the Gulf states are openly declaring that they're no longer overly concerned with the future of the Palestinian people means that the Palestinians now really need to rethink how they've been going about this for the past few decades, whether it's working, and what they can do to further their cause now.
Because the only regional states that are left really promoting them are Turkey, Iran, and all the Iranian proxies, including, of course, the Damascus government.
Yeah, and I think what you're seeing more broadly as well is, you know, Turkey and Iran are still very much proponents of this idea of Islamism, right? That Islam can have a place in modern politics, and trying to restore the grandeur of the caliphate in the case of Turkey. And what some of these other states, like the Gulf states, are saying is, no, let's keep separation of politics and religion, and let's focus on things like economic cooperation and security. Ultimately, I think a lot of people in positions of power, and maybe the more affluent and educated, do see a more transactional future as being the one that is more appealing to them, because it would allow for economic growth. But you have to remember, again, coming back to this idea of what the Arab street wants, what the average man on the street, who maybe is not super educated, who is not super affluent, who is not well traveled, he may have a very different idea about what the future of his region should be.
So this issue might well actually be a bottling up of another source of tension within some of the more traditional Arab countries that has yet to emerge. I'm sorry. We need to.
We could spend all hour on that topic.
I want to now ask you a more personal question, and I'll ask you a couple of questions. And that is dealing with fear, because you've had some hellishly dangerous experiences, very risky, very frightening. Your book, which I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed and was fascinated by, seems a never-ending series of close shaves, every bloody chapter, as far as I can see, especially in Syria, of course, where so many of your friends and colleagues died. Can I ask you whether you've ever learned how to deal with fear? You developed strategies that allow you to cope, remain focused on the job, and despite the dangers?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I should be asking you this question, Richard. But here's the thing about fear. People often ask me, "Do you not get scared?" Of course, I get scared. And you're an idiot if you don't get scared, because fear has a very real function, right? Fear is what enables us to understand, I need to get out of this situation. So fear is important. And the minute you really stop feeling fear, that means you've become desensitized to danger, which does happen when you spend too long in a war zone. And it's usually a sign that you need to go home, because fear serves you well. Now, what doesn't serve you in a war zone is panic. And this is a crucial difference. You can be very afraid, but you cannot be someone who flaps. And what do I mean by that? And it really is one of those things that is just, I think, intrinsic in each and every one of us. There are people, and I've been with them sometimes in the field, who when they're suddenly in a dangerous situation, they start to panic, they start to flap, they get very loud, they get very animated. And a lot of effort has to be spent on trying to calm the person down. When I get very, very frightened, have the reverse. I become very quiet and very, very calm. Inside, deep inside, there is, of course, a real panic happening. But the way I manifest that on the surface is through real quietness and deep calm. And that's very important, because as you well know, when you're in any kind of a kinetic situation or a situation where there are guns out and people are shouting, the worst thing you can do is to start to panic. The worst thing you can do is raise your voice. The worst thing you can do is start to gesticulate wildly. So what you learn over the years is, no matter how fearful you're feeling, and no matter how much your instinct is telling you just to run, take a moment, shut yourself down a little bit, be very quiet and still, and try to work out sensibly what the best course of action is. Because sometimes you might want to run, and that might feel like the normal instinct, but that's not always the best thing to do. Sometimes running in itself can be very dangerous. Sometimes it's better just to get very low down on the ground, or find a place where you can take some shelter, or pull over the car for a while until there's all different types of situations, and each requires a different reaction. Yeah, go on.
I was going to say, what really you're saying, which so echoes with my experience, is that one of your most important weapons against fear is knowledge, is understanding the kind of environment you're in and what work and what won't work. So for example, if in Africa, it happened to me a number of times, and you're stopped by armed men with AK-47s and machetes, where things could so quickly go wrong, because frequently they're drugged up to the teeth. Actually, my best weapon always is a smile, and to try and create some sense of human bond. And that sort of thing would never work in a different environment.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's what you learn on the job, right? That's what you learn with experience. Because when I first went to Baghdad as a 25-year-old, I had never been to a war zone in my life. And I had no idea what I was doing or what I was about. And this is why the book is called The Education of a Journalist, by the way, because it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. You don't automatically become knowledgeable about these situations. But the more experience you have, the better adept you are at navigating them. So to continue with your example, I was taken hostage for the day, and thank goodness it was only for a day, in eastern Ukraine by pro-Russian separatists. And I sort of understood that, first of all, these people were not going to execute me. I wasn't in Syria. They weren't ISIS. And like you said, I speak some Russian. So I started quietly trying to just humanize myself in some way, ask a question in Russian, tell them something about you, nothing political, obviously, something just human, normal, like I have a son, or I'm married, or I love ice cream. It can be anything. But that process of just, I'm now a human being, as opposed to just a hostage with a blindfold over my face. But this is only something you learn after time and spending long periods in these dangerous arenas.
Did Parenthood change you?
Parenthood absolutely has changed me. for a number of reasons and in a number of ways. I think there's always an expectation, especially when you're a woman and you're a mother, that you're not going to go to conflict zones anymore. I still travel to conflict zones, and I still will travel to conflict zones. I don't want to take quite the same risks. So some of the, the chapters that you allude to in the book where there were some really close calls, I don't want to be on a front line now where there are bullets whizzing over my head. I need to be as close to the front line as I can so that I can tell the stories of the people who are living there, which I feel is my primary interest or passion. And I think that motherhood has given me more compassion in some ways. In terms of how I tell stories, it's made me more emotionally porous, particularly acutely sensitive to the suffering of children and to the sacrifice made by women and mothers in war zones. So I do feel passionately that I want to keep doing this work, but I'm mindful that my primary responsibility is to my children as a mother. And so I try to take even more precautions than I already did.
Great. Now let's go back to our trip around the world.
Yes.
China. Right, you spent quite a lot of time in Beijing.
Yeah.
Of course, much closer to us in Australia than it is to you, either in London or in the States. Now, you wrote that China is like a pressure cooker. That popular discontent is never far below the surface, and the communist states needs to be more and more oppressive to control it. Now, a few years later, of course, President Xi seems to have gained even more control, imposed even higher levels of oppression to keep the lid on that pressure cooker. So my question is, do you think that this is a pressure cooker that ever will or even ever can blow? Or is the system of state surveillance and oppression now so effective that the population will forever be subjugated?
I think for now, there's no sign that the pressure cooker is going to blow. And you only need to look at the economic information out today that China has grown in the last quarter by 4.9%, which frankly, given the backdrop of this global pandemic, is staggering, right? And that seems to me to be the sort of Faustian bargain that the Communist Party has made with the populace, which is you will continue to rise from poverty, you will continue to amass more wealth, and in return, you agree essentially to not challenge the state. And most Chinese people who I have met are okay with that, are happy with that. They want to work hard, they want to make money, they want to improve their economic lot. And for the last however many years, they've seen 9% growth consistently, which is extraordinary. I think if China ever ran into a serious economic crisis and you were looking at a protracted recession, then you could very much potentially have some kind of protest movement erupting. But, and we did see that, I lived in China from 2009 to 2011. And after the 2008 crash, there were pockets of protests of unpaid wages, taxi drivers. I mean, you did see that sort of activity occasionally. But for the most part, everyone seems to have bought into the idea that they want to be a part of a strong, united China with great economic growth. I think the question then becomes, how do other countries around the world, and of course I'm thinking particularly the US, learn to embrace or accept or coexist with an increasingly assertive China? And this is going to be the big challenge, I think, no matter who wins the US presidential election on November 3rd, we are now frighteningly close to one wrong footing, and you could be looking at another Cold War between the US and China, which I don't think anyone stands to benefit from. So it will be really interesting to see how the next US president, whether it continues to be Trump or whether it's Vice President Biden, how they're going to navigate that tightrope. And it is a tightrope.
Well, we might come back to the States in a moment, but I'd like to now move to Russia. Because you spent obviously time in Moscow and you've seen the Russians pretty close up. Now, as someone of British heritage, I was appalled by the Salisbury poisonings. I was shocked by the cynicism of Russia's policy in Syria, and that's even before considering election meddling in the West. So is a revanchist oppositionist Russia, Putin's Russia, what the West now has to live with? Do we have to accept it's inevitable that we'll be in almost permanent opposition to Moscow? Or is there something that we can do to help reduce tension, improve relations, and encourage a more responsible global citizenship from Putin and his government?
I think that's such a good question. Fundamentally, the way things stand now, I think it would have been different in the early 2000s, right? Soon after Putin took power. Where we are now, I think we have to understand that the one asset that Russia has is that, President Putin is a great strategist, but he's also a great improviser, right? So he's nimble on his feet. He's able to see a moment like President Obama saying chemical weapons in Syria are a red line, then not enforcing that red line. And he's able to say, okay, this is a moment where Russia can step in and fill the void. This is a moment where Russia can increase its standing in the Middle East and can gain some leverage at the negotiating table. And it's important to remember that on many levels, Russia does not actually pose a significant threat at all. Its economy is essentially in tatters. It has not been able to diversify it from natural resources. Corruption is a huge problem. So it doesn't pose any real challenge economically. It also doesn't really pose a challenge ideologically in the same way that it did under the Soviet Union, where, communism was a genuine ideology. What is Russia's ideology right now? There isn't one, really. You could argue nationalism, you could argue we're seeing a return to the Orthodox Church, but essentially these are kind of improvised ideas rather than a more coherent and well thought out ideology. So in that sense, the West, I think, sometimes has a tendency to over-egg the real threat that Russia poses. I do think, notwithstanding that, we've seen what Russia is capable of. We've seen the lengths that they're willing to go to, and we've seen that they're not willing, essentially, to play by the rule book, right? Everything that we say, or that, Western governments say, this cannot stand, one doesn't do this, one does that, responsible nation doesn't behave in that way. Russia is willing to do that. And whether that's the use of Novichok in Salisbury, or now with Alexei Navalny, the leader of the opposition, Russia has made it clear again and again that the only rules it's willing to play by are its rules. At the same time, in a similar sense to China, we see all of our economies now are so interconnected. And, the big part of the UK's reaction to this Skripal poisoning has been a sort of growing realization that whatever the UK might want to do to punish Russia for this kind of behavior, the UK finds itself in a bit of a bind, and Europe more broadly finds itself in a bit of a bind, because there is such deep layers of interconnectedness in these economies. And that makes it very difficult to punish Russia without punishing oneself. And also keep in mind that when Russia is punished, what I found when I lived in Russia is that the Russians have a very strong mentality of struggle and survive, batten down the hatches and survive. And they're willing to undergo a lot more economic privation, certainly than people in the West are, in order to kind of stand up for their country. At the same time, I don't want to over exaggerate that, because I do think that President Putin is facing unprecedented levels of discontent in his country. I do think that the protest movements are gathering steam, and that might be part of the reason that Alexei Navalny was poisoned in the first place. But more broadly, to answer your question, I don't think there's an easy answer. I was having this conversation recently with the former foreign minister of Germany. There is no easy answer or no panacea readily available to dealing with Russia.
One of the problems, of course, with dealing with Russia, and indeed with China, and we alluded to it before, was that for the vast majority of the period since 1945, the free world, if I can call it that, has been organized, controlled, and led from a generally enlightened leadership in Washington, D.C. And there was real meaning to that idea of a shining city upon the hill. That seems to be absent today. the United States, as you mentioned, is just simply not prepared or doesn't seem to be prepared to provide the kind of global leadership for countries like ourselves in Australia, or indeed Britain, or the West, to confront some of the bad behaviors that we're seeing.
I think that's very true. And I think that, you know, on one level, one can understand it, okay? Because this isn't just about President Trump. This really goes back to President Obama as well. And you look at the, you know, at the Iraq War and how much money that cost the US, how it really negatively affected the US's standing in the region, how many American servicemen and women, as well as British and Allied, and how many Iraqis died. I mean, the loss of life was huge. So I understand the US's impulse to kind of pivot away, especially now that they really are not in a position where they rely as much on oil from the Middle East any longer. So it makes sense that you would see this kind of retreat from, let's say, nation building or military intervention. Also look at Afghanistan, 19 years later, what has really been achieved? What is the benchmark for success? Has the US reached it? It doesn't look good, right? So one can understand the desire to stop engaging in that kind of activity. At the same time, what I think Americans maybe sometimes don't realize is that in the same way that there is a cost for action, that there are repercussions for action, there is also a cost for inaction. It's not that if you stand out on the sidelines and don't get involved, that everybody then gives you a free pass. No, there are real consequences for standing on the sidelines and not getting involved. And we saw that in Syria, as we just discussed with Russia. And I think we're seeing that now, more broadly speaking, globally. President Trump has made it very clear that he really is much more interested in what's going on in the US than he is in any meaningful engagement with the rest of the world. He's even been willing to call into question all the relationships and alliances that have essentially created our understanding of the West. And to a certain extent, again, there are many Americans who will say, yes, why should we pay for NATO? Why should we have troops in Germany? Why should we support all these countries in Asia and have US military bases? We don't want to be, well, breaking news. If you're not involved in these efforts, if you're not supporting allies, if you don't have military bases in Asia, then you're creating the space for other global superpowers to fill that vacuum. You're creating a space where a more dominant China asserts itself even further. And this is something that I think Americans sometimes don't understand, is that inaction has consequences too. I want to make it clear, as I just said before, that the long goodbye, which is what I've heard some foreign policy wonks refer to as America's gradual retreat from the world, this sort of introverted posture, looking inwards. This has been going on for quite some time. It started under President Obama, and I don't necessarily think it will stop. Even if Joe Biden is elected president, I don't think that means you're going to see the US becoming more engaged. What I do think it means is that you will at least see an attempt to sort of, scale back the erosion of these alliances that President Trump has really set about diminishing in a certain sense. But I don't think it's going to mean a magic bullet. The US is going to step to the fore again to take on the role of being the world's policeman.
Well, let's turn now away from Donald Trump and America, back to you again on a more personal question, if I may. Because I mean, you write beautifully, like with a very light touch, and your book's a real pleasure to read. And what I enjoy is even when you're dealing with quite difficult subjects, you've always got a sense of humor there. That's never far below the surface. But the one area where your anger does come through very clearly is when you're talking about sexism and misogyny. You've been sexually assaulted. You've been dismissed as a woman. You've had to deal with contempt for being a woman. But what came across to me in your book most of all, even above the shocking events that have occurred to you personally, is how you carry a torch for all those women who live in cultures that'll never allow them to develop their potential. And you quote Salman Rushdie talking of the women in Pakistan. Shame is like everything else. Eventually, it becomes part of the furniture. So this is a two-part question. The first is, what advice would you offer young women today in our Western societies who face everyday casual sexism from men who really should know better? And the second is, can we Westerners, should we Westerners, do anything for the many millions of women who are oppressed in cultures that are different from ours?
Both very good questions. I mean, my advice to women today is, first of all, I hope that young women understand the great strides that have been made, because, you know, the environment I'm living and working in now is so radically different from the one I was living and working in 15 years ago. I can't tell you the comments that one used to get in the field, particularly. I never felt that I was penalized against in any way, but it was just this sort of casual, pervasive misogyny that you would often run into. For me personally, I have always found, and maybe this is a generational thing, that the best thing to do is to diffuse a situation like that with humor or grace, and not to get hung up on it, and just to move on. And I think that I think it's very difficult, because if you push back too hard, and I write about this in the book, you're labeled as pushy, you're aggressive, you're chippy. But if you don't push back at all, you get steamrolled. And so how do you politely assert your authority without doing it in a way that is perceived of as being aggressive or threatening in some way? This is still a tightrope that women are being forced to walk. I'm sure it's changing a little bit for the younger generation. I personally don't think that the answer is to infantilize women, by which I mean, I don't think that the answer is to create so many rules that men literally feel like in any sort of walk of life or any professional context that they need to like get a contract signed before they can speak to you, before they could ask you on a date, before that, obviously there need to be boundaries. But for me, the boundaries should partially be set by individual women. It should be a subjective thing, and every woman has to decide what she's comfortable with and what she's not comfortable with. So that's what I would say on that. And I would also say, don't focus so much, ladies, on the limitations and the misogyny and all the focus on the assets. Because for me, being a woman and doing my job has been a huge asset. It's allowed me to travel to places that my male colleagues can't. I'm often perceived as less threatening. And by the way, I have access to 50% of the population in some of these more conservative societies that my male colleagues can't even talk to or interview. So I have chosen to view it as an asset. Now, coming to those 50% of the women who my male colleagues have no asset to, which is sort of your second question, I do think, and in my understanding, we do have different ideas about the world depending on who we are and where we grew up and how we were educated. And I've seen firsthand in my experience that unfortunately it does not work, even if the intentions are the best, to kind of impose your ideas or your way of life or your cultural norms onto another society. Often you create a sort of pendulum swing or a backlash in the other direction, even if your intentions, as I said, are the best. So it becomes a really tricky business trying to promote, for example, women's education in countries where traditionally women have faced a lot of oppression. I saw this, I went last year and stayed with the Taliban in Afghanistan for 3 days. And it was interesting to me to see, frankly, that outside of the cities, it didn't even matter if you were in government territory or Taliban territory. Women's education, for example, was simply not a priority. Once women hit puberty, forget it, it's over. There's no longer any reason in the minds of many parents to continue to send their kids to school because they need their girls at home for various reasons. I don't know how you combat that beyond, trying to provide education, trying to improve the economy in these countries in order that, because obviously often wealth can then trickle down and provide more opportunities. There's nothing in Islam that says that women shouldn't go to school. Quite the reverse, women's education is encouraged. And yet we find ourselves in this situation where so many countries, where there's pockets within many countries where women are not given access to education in the ways that they should be. It sounds like a cop-out, Richard, but I haven't seen anyone yet come up with a really good solution for how to deal with this and how to combat this, except that I think the solution needs to come from within those cultures, possibly with outside assistance, but it can't come from the outside.
Yeah, but I mean, again, going back to my experience in Africa, I mean, it's just so difficult to turn a blind eye to female genital mutilation. I mean, you just can't. And you were quite right, obviously, education is absolutely critical to this. But it's obviously something we're not going to solve tonight because we're running out of time. I really need to ask a couple more questions. So I'm going to return to the Middle East if I can, and that's of all your many overseas assignments, of all the wars you've covered, the Syrian war is the one that has to affect you the most emotionally. Can you explain why?
Well, I'd never in my life experienced a conflict like Syria, in the sense that, first of all, there's this David-Goliath dynamic. You have, on the one hand, an uprising that began as peaceful protests, people seeing the excitement of the Arab Spring rippling across the region around them and feeling emboldened to stand up together and demand a better future for their children and demand freedom. That's how it started, this protest movement at its core. And it was not religious. I was there covering it in the early days. There were Alawites who were supporting the protest movement. There were Christians, there were Sunnis, there were Shia. This was a peaceful protest movement. And you saw that morph into an armed uprising in a relatively short space of time. But still, in terms of the level of armed uprising that we're talking about carpenters and school teachers with light weapons fighting a sophisticated army with an air force and with very powerful and wealthy international backers in the form of Russia and Iran. So already you had this David-Goliath dynamic. Secondly, I've never really seen that level of bravery from the participants in this uprising, who were literally willing to march into a hail of bullets to demand a better future for their children. And partly they were willing to do that because they genuinely believed, after looking at what happened in Libya, that if they were massacred, that the US and the West more broadly would come in to help them, that there would be the creation of a no-fly zone, the likes of which we had seen in Libya, and that there would be some form of international intervention to avert a bloodbath. We saw, of course, that did not happen. And we saw that with the growing realization that that would not happen, Assad and his regime became more and more emboldened. And again, I have seen so many horrors in war, civilians killed. I have never seen civilians so ruthlessly targeted in this way. I have never seen a regime, frankly, outside of Nazi Germany or maybe the Khmer Rouge, that, takes photographs of the thousands of prisoners that they torture and kill, who disappear into these prisons, never to be seen again in the light of day. I've never seen a regime that gasses its own people, that uses chemical weapons against its own people, that bombs hospitals, that bombs schools, that uses nerve agents and burning agents. I had just never experienced a conflict quite like that. I've also never worked on a story where every single trip I did to Syria, every single trip, and you're talking 12 or 14 trips, in the days or weeks or months following that trip, I would find out that, the two activists who hosted me had disappeared into prisons, never to be seen again. The one medic who was showing me around was killed by a shell. The American journalist who I befriended, Austin Tice, was captured by the regime and has not been seen or heard from since. My friend Jim Foley, my friend Pete Kasich were captured by ISIS and executed. Every trip, somebody I knew, somebody I had spent time with, somebody I cared about was later killed or kidnapped or disappeared. And that takes, of course, a huge emotional toll, but it also becomes so frustrating when you're telling this story to a wider audience. Why does the world not care more about this? Why is the international community so hamstrung? How is it that they can't come together after all the talk after Rwanda of never again, never again? And we see massacres being carried out on an almost daily basis in Syria. And yet the international community is not able to come together in some meaningful way to do something to mitigate the suffering of the Syrian people.
It's a harrowing description. When back in London in 2011, Prime Minister Cameron asked the British Chief of Defence Staff at the time what militarily the British might do in Syria, we went back to him with a simple choice. The only thing that would work, the only thing that stood a good chance of achieving the government's objective, which was to remove Assad, that was the sole objective, was to take all the anti-government militias, the carpenters and the plumbers and the taxi drivers you're referring to, take them all out of Syria and encamp them in Jordan. There we could train them, equip, organize them into perhaps 100,000-man army. And when they're ready, perhaps after a year or so, then they could actually invade Syria, supported by American air power, and rather like what happened in 2003 with Baghdad, quickly capture Damascus and the regime collapse. Any other plan, the Prime Minister was told at the time, was doomed to fail. It was just a question of how long and how many people would die. And his response was, and I'm quoting him, "It's beyond what's politically possible." That was in Britain, and of course in the USA, we know that it wasn't anything was politically possible for Obama either. Now, I know that you did everything you could, at great personal risk, to bring the unfolding disaster into our living rooms. But the question is, does the media actually have a role, a responsibility perhaps to help shift that line of what, in Cameron's words, what's politically possible, by raising the profile and creating such a sense of responsibility and outrage amongst the West that actually we do act in things in a way that we wouldn't otherwise? Or is the media's role simply to inform?
I think that's an excellent question. And, here's what I would say. Two things. First of all, when we look at what was possible in Syria, I'm not saying that military intervention was necessarily the answer in Syria at all. What I'm saying is when the US president stands up and says Bashar al-Assad must go, then he really needs to do something in order to make that happen, for those words not to look like empty promises. As Lyndon Johnson once said, if you tell a man to go to hell, you better be sure you can make him go there, right? And when the US president stand up and says chemical weapons are a red line, then chemical weapons need to be a red line. And if they're not, and if you have no interest in getting involved militarily, then I think America needs to arguably keep its mouth shut in essence, because what happens is that you create a moral hazard. And a big part of why these people were willing to go out and die in the dozens and the hundreds and the thousands was because they thought it was going to precipitate some kind of a military intervention. And so that's just something that I think all of us need to keep in mind going forward, is the dangers of lip service, right? In terms of the moral hazard that's created. More broadly speaking, I nearly had a nervous breakdown covering Syria, because no matter how hard I worked or how many friends I lost or how many risks I took or how great my storytelling was, it wasn't doing anything to mitigate the suffering of the Syrian people. It wasn't doing anything to change the policy regarding Syria. And then I had a sort of epiphany, which I have carried with me ever since, which is to understand my role in a much more humble way. And I think that's essential for any journalist who wants to do this kind of work in the long term. You have to have a more humble approach. Now I understand that my job is to illuminate a problem, to give a voice to people who might not have a voice, to bear witness to tell these stories, to collect possible information for prosecution, maybe one day for war crimes. My job is not to solve the problem. My job is not to end the war. That is way beyond my remit. And there was a huge amount of hubris at play that allowed me to think that anything I did really could even potentially achieve that objective. And I think it's a dangerous objective. You know, we buy into this idea a lot in the world. You can make a difference. And of course you can make a positive impact. But one journalist alone is not going to alter the history, or alter the course of history or the course of the Syrian civil war. And for me, that was both devastating, but ultimately really freeing as well. Because when I understood my role in much more humble terms, it allowed me to keep doing it and keep working hard. Because otherwise, frankly, you just throw your hands up in the air and you'd say, I give up, I quit, I can't do this, so I'm not going to do it. And now I understand that there are other people with way more important jobs than I have who really are responsible more for the kind of solving the problem part. My job is to shine a spotlight on it.
Clarissa, all I can say is thank you. This has been a really, really brilliant conversation, and I'm humbled to be allowed to talk with you. I'm going to throw it open to Q&A now, which Alistair, I hope, is going to curate for us. Alistair.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I don't know. No, really excellent, Clarissa. Thank you. I think the questions are sort of falling into two camps. Some are geopolitical, and others are to do with. I think we've got definitely some young people here who are inspired. So I'd like to start with them first.
Yeah.
First question: Could you talk to your experience of language learning? How essential have your 7 languages been to doing what you do as a journalist?
Yeah. So I think every journalist has kind of their superpower or their mechanism for deepening their work in some way. For me, it's always been about immersion in another culture. I like to go and live in a place, and as long as I have a working Wi-Fi connection and maybe AC, I'm going to be just fine. And that's how I really learn to understand a culture or a conflict or whatever it may be. So for me, languages are essential. I've always loved them. I speak them at varying degrees. They're not all perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but you will find that even just speaking a little bit of Arabic, a little bit of Russian, a little bit of Mandarin, it opens doors. It enables people to feel more comfortable around you. So it's been a huge boon for me personally. That said, I know some brilliant international correspondents who do not speak a lick of even a second language. And that's okay too. They might be superb with the military analysis or whatever it is. They'll have their strengths. So if you're drawn towards languages and enjoy them, then yes, I think it's a great tool to deepen your understanding of different cultures and stories. But if you're not a natural linguist, don't sweat it. You don't have to learn languages to be good at this job.
That's good advice. Thank you. Just looking at your own career path, we've seen, I suppose, maybe more than mainstream media cutting back on resources and expenditure. The question is, how important is it still now to have foreign correspondents who actually go out there?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hugely important. Obviously, I'm biased, but I'm really alarmed. And we've seen it happen in my lifetime as well. I mean, this has been going on for a while. All of the US networks used to have bureaus in Cairo and all over the world, in South Korea and Seoul. And, you know, nowadays you have more the sort of one-man band or the freelancer who sort of, and that's better than nothing, 100%. But many networks now don't have any presence overseas, or they'll have one bureau in London that covers the rest of the world. And of course, that's really limiting, because if you're not immersed in that country and that culture and that place, you're not following the minutiae of the day-to-day developments of a story. You're not sensitive to the shifts in dynamics, and you can miss good stories, and your storytelling also just becomes a little more flat when you have only people parachuting in for a day or two. So I'm a big advocate of having many bureaus overseas. I'm fortunate to work at CNN, which still does, but I fully understand that in this economic climate, and particularly in this era of COVID, that is increasingly challenging for many networks.
Well, perhaps if just following on CNN, I was wanting to ask you a question. And in the book, I'm just going to switch to Syria a little bit, but you talk about Samantha Power, who was the US ambassador to the UN at the time, inviting you to address the Security Council. And you quote Madeleine Albright, I think, as saying that CNN's often seen as the 16th member of the Security Council. But how was that as an experience for you?
It was hugely, well, first of all, it was a huge privilege. I had never been asked. It's very rare, even for any journalist, to be asked to speak at the Security Council. This was an informal session, but nonetheless, it was a great privilege. And more than that, it was hugely cathartic for me. As I just explained, the Syrian experience was very devastating and challenging for me on a personal and professional level. And to be able to sit in a room with these different ambassadors and to look them in the eye and say, not just you, the Russian ambassador, but you, the American ambassador, you, the French, all of us, and us, the journalists, and us, the aid workers, we have all failed the Syrian people, and shame on us. And, Richard was asking about that line of, whether are you a journalist, are you an activist, are you an advocate? And it does get a little bit blurred. And I would say with Syria, I crossed lines, definitely. But to have that moment and to have that platform, to be able to say on behalf of, many, many, many people all around the world, not just in Syria, we have failed and this is shameful, was for me hugely cathartic.
Absolutely. As I say, you traveled around the world with Richard, and our questions are coming from all around, so I'll try and get through as many as we can. Just on Palestine and Israel, it's a double-edged question. Firstly, how much has the US been on where the Palestinians are at the moment? How much of an influence has that been? But secondly, do you think the relationships now, peace agreements between some of the Gulf countries and Israel, is actually perhaps going to give the Palestinians a better chance to negotiate with Israel? There's a double question there.
I don't know that it'll give them a better chance to negotiate with Israel, starting with the latter question. I think ultimately speaking, in the long run, there are many people who feel that a Middle East that is less militarized, that has improved economic cooperation between these various different countries, is only going to ultimately help the Palestinians, perhaps not so much in their objective of having their own state, but at least in terms of having a better quality of life. And so I think many people do feel that. In terms of the US and the influence, I mean, I think we need to be, obviously it's seen as a tremendous success for the Trump administration that they were able to preside over or encourage this normalization of relations with the UAE and Bahrain. And it'll be very interesting, as I said earlier, to see who comes next. But the deal of the century, as it was dubbed, did not happen. And I don't think that the Trump administration has made any real traction with the Palestinians at all. What the Trump administration did, and it was quite clever, and frankly also for the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who threw this grenade of annexation on the table, and then the UAE was able to come in with America's, sort of guidance or acting as a go-between and say, listen, if you take annexation off the table, we'll offer the normalization of relations. Of course, Netanyahu never really wanted annexation either. Nobody actually wanted annexation. Nobody supported it. And it never even happened. But by throwing the grenade on the table, anyone who said, oh, suddenly the grenade became this incredible point for bargaining and creating a deal. And Netanyahu was able to climb down from his promise of annexation. The Jordanians were able to breathe a sigh of relief. The US was able to say, oh, look, we've averted a catastrophe and created the normalization of relations. The UAE was able to claim that they'd stopped annexation. And so this whole deal came about over something that, frankly, wasn't actually a tangible reality yet. So I'm not trying to underplay its significance. I do think it's really significant, particularly if other dominoes start to fall. And I think it's very indicative of the broader zeitgeist that we're seeing in the region. But no, I don't think it wasn't the deal of the century. It wasn't what the Trump administration set out to do in the beginning. And I don't think for now that it's dramatically altered the situation for most Palestinians. The Palestinians, broadly speaking, I think, unfortunately, are the losers in this deal.
Thank you. There's a question here about fake news.
There's always got to be one.
It had to come up, but to what extent is that misleading the public's perception of global issues, whether it's Syria conflict or anything in the US? I mean, how do you deal with it?
I mean, it's a nightmare, honestly. It really is. And I'll tell you why. Because listen, we're not perfect as journalists. The mainstream media is far from perfect. We make mistakes. We obviously have biases that we come to the table with. Everyone does. But we do tend to base our storytelling in facts. And that is hugely important. I think there is scope for a diversity of storytelling as long as we agree to stay within the realm of what is factually correct, what is real, what is actually happening. The thing that disturbs me about terms like fake news being bandied about is it's sort of this insidious idea that truth doesn't really exist, right? That there is no such thing as the truth, that there's just so many different, everyone's a liar, and so why believe in any of it? And the problem with that is when you have a society that succumbs to that, that says, you're right, everyone's a liar, let's just not trust anyone, you are intensely vulnerable as a society to authoritarians. And we've seen this throughout history, and we've seen this throughout the world. So I think that journalists provide a fundamentally important service, and we may not always get it right, but the consistent and persistent disparagement of journalists is dangerous, not just ideologically, but also it can be physically dangerous for journalists living in countries under authoritarian control. If the president of the United States declares open season on journalists and says that they're enemy of the people, what message does that send to leaders around the world?
Well, I've got an eye on the clock because we are rapidly approaching our hour, and I know you have a big day. Maybe we can get two more questions in, one geopolitical and one on career planning. But just very, very broadly, it said that the international rules-based order is under threat. If it collapses, what do you think will replace it? And if you can answer that.
I can answer that in 90 seconds. I mean, what replaces it is one of two things, either chaos or authoritarianism. And listen, liberal democracies are facing their greatest challenge and their greatest threat that they have in many decades. And, you know, part of the weakness of a liberal democracy is that it creates a space for other ideologies that then, when they assume power, do not allow the space for other ideologies. So I think that this is an existential moment for liberal democracies. I can't say what the cure is and how they can sort of reinvent themselves or adapt to the challenges of the modern world. But let's just say I do think there's a lot at stake.
That was very professionally answered. Thank you. So I think our final question to end up is, what advice would you have for young people looking for career in journalism or in international affairs more broadly?
Yeah. First of all, I'm so delighted when I meet young people who want to be journalists, who want to get involved in international affairs, who care about the world, who are looking outwards instead of just inwards. I think it's so hugely important. We live in a global world. It is only getting smaller and smaller by the day in terms of how information can be passed and shared. And so it's hugely important for young people to take an interest and go into these things. I would just say, follow your passion, work hard. It does require a lot of personal sacrifice in terms of, you know, taking these opportunities. You're going to miss out on Thanksgivings and Christmases and weddings and all of that, but stick with your guns, tune out the noise, turn off Twitter, stick to the facts, and keep going.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Clarissa and Richard, it brings us to the close of our hour, unfortunately. I mean, as Richard said, it's been an absolute privilege having you on. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you to everyone watching for your interest. Some really great questions, and I'm sorry we didn't have another hour to get through them, but I think we've covered everything in gist, if not in detail. So to those at home, again, this again is the book. Get hold of it. Even if you're in lockdown in Melbourne, it's readily available online, as I know. But thank you all very much. Thank you again to Clarissa. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Clarissa.
Final word.
Thank you. Thank you. I've had such a lovely time. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you all. And thanks. Stay safe, everyone. And we'll see you again at the next webinar.